Now, on the symbiont example,
well, that's where I part with Dawkins. Sorry, that is where I part with Dawkins. I don't think that religion is simply a virus. I don't think that religion is simply a virus. I think it's a mimetic complex which is symbiotic in a lot of ways with its host, but it is its own evolving entity.
Now, there is a problem with the symbiont metaphor, and I reject it. And the virus also, I reject it. Because there is a fundamental difference between memes and viruses and symbionts. The symbionts and viruses have their own, what I call a printer. Of course, it's a made-up word, but it really designates the ensemble of molecules that end up printing the gene into another copy. All of these things, they have their printer, and these printers, they make errors that are not directed by the partner in the symbiotic relationship. In other words, if I'm living a symbiotic relationship with chicken, for example, I have 10 chicken in my backyard, and in fact, the chicken help me feed my babies, and therefore I will have more babies, and they will have their own chicken. There's a symbiosis going on here. However, every chicken is still reproducing its own genes and mutating its own genes. The difference with human culture is that human culture does not generate its own mutations randomly. That's why I say it's not Darwinian, or we could say post-Darwinian. There is a bias in the mutations that occur to human culture, which you don't see in a virus, you don't see in human beings, you don't see in chicken. And that bias is the fact that the memes are endowed by machines, by the brain, the human brain, as it copies the memes in a way that the human brain is already pre-evolved to filter out the bad stuff. There are totally new memes from current society that you wouldn't speak about with your daughter, for example. Let's say sexual memes on the internet. You won't bring them up talking to your daughter. And this tells me that the human brain and human psychology, they have evolved not to get passed through by these memes as some form of arbitrary copying machine. In the same way, our genes pass through the DNA replicase as arbitrary machine. I mean, our genes, they don't, the 60 mutations that you see occurring in the human genome on every generation, there's nothing directing this. There's not an engineer in human culture deciding we're going to do it that way or that other way. To make a parallel about how I truly see memes, imagine we had a bunch of squirrels in a park, and you were to have a guy who is absolutely obsessed with the reproduction of these squirrels, and in fact would modify their genes at every generation, every time a squirrel makes a baby, this guy would have added some features. You would end up with squirrels with 8 limbs, and some of them would have laser eyes. Essentially, the squirrel would have been used by the genetic modifier human being to essentially create a Frankenstein type creation of his own. Now, everyone would agree that these modified squirrels, they've not evolved through Darwinian evolution. The guy would probably program his own genes, try some computation on his computer to try to guess what will this gene do, and he might do some attempts. But the squirrel would not be reproducing on his own. He would not have a copy mechanism. He would be subject to constant reshaping and sculpting according to human desire. Well, I think that human culture is just like the modified squirrel. It is a Frankensteinist creation of the human brain, which adds up information that, yes, does get accumulated across generations, but only according to how it favors human reproduction. That's why we see human culture being shaped the way it is. That's why we see Mormon people making more babies. It's because these cultural artifacts have been proven through time, and they have showed their evolutionary success in terms of human reproduction. Now, if you're not arguing that memes are evolving for themselves in the same way that DNA does, then I guess we agree. But then it's important to have a word. It's important to say
memes do evolve for themselves, like a virus evolves for itself.
Yeah, but you don't have the mechanism by which they mutate. So you haven't shown me how
we
does
do.
a meme
I explained
mutate.
it already.
Well, you told me the example of LSD, and you told me that's random. Well, no, I denied it. It's not random. It's not random when a human being takes a meme on the internet and likes it or doesn't like it. We have pre-evolved features of our brain that are selecting and modifying and sculpting.
Can I talk about that for a second?
Memes. Yep.
Can I talk about that? You say that we had pre-evolved mechanisms in the brain. Is that what you said?
Yep.
Yeah, so that is the environment. Right. So there are preferences. There are certain things that are sticky and certain things that are not sticky within the mindosphere. And those are the selection pressures that select whether or not a new idea will be popular or not. So you mentioned that you wrote a book. You probably spent a lot of creative energy on that. I assume probably years of creative energy purposely writing a book, but you don't get to decide whether or not that book becomes popular or not. There's actually very little you can do. There's something about the culture at large that's going to decide that. There's something about the architecture of the brains that it comes in contact with that's going to decide that. That's the natural selection that memes have to go through. So your book is going to be selected based on a whole bunch of factors that already exist in the minds of readers and potential readers that are going to come in contact with your book. And we have these two very distinct processes. We have the creation of novelty, and we have the selection that happens afterward. And Darwin's big discovery was that these two things together end up producing an incredibly efficient, natural creative mechanism. Descent with modification plus selection. The vast majority of inventions, the vast majority of ideas, the vast majority of things that get spit out there go nowhere. They die. Just like the vast majority of mutations are deleterious, the vast majority of modifications that happen to ideas, whether they're accidental or someone's actually trying to make something that will be popular, the vast majority just go by the wayside. They fail. And I think you might be confusing that selective pressure with creative forces in your denial to accept this. What's an entire field of science. The other aspect about memes that is really important is that memes outlive both their host oftentimes, and they outlive the use that host had for them. And if I could go through an example, a 5,000-year evolution of chocolate. I actually had slides for this, but unfortunately I can't show it because it's really fascinating to see how chocolate is made. This might be helpful because the important thing to understand about cultural evolution is that it can build things that are smarter than us. We have to study them to figure out how it is that they work. We have to study to figure out why Mormonism is so good at making people survive. We have to study that in hindsight, and the Mormons can't tell you. And it has to actually be studied, just like we have to study the eye to figure out how the hell it works. These are really complicated structures. The reason they work is really complicated. It's not understood by the people who are even using it. Mormons don't understand why they're so good at survival and reproduction. Do you mind if I go through the chocolate example, but first, if you have any objections to what I just said?
Well, I will just say a quick objection, which is we keep having the metaphorical overlap between memes and replicators, and none of this I've denied. The problem is I still don't have the mechanism by which memes mutate, and actually I have it. It is what the human psychology does to it. Now you say it's only a creative force and then it's a matter of selection. I disagree. We have taboos, we have filtering entities in our brain that my book, it doesn't really concern my brain whether this book spreads. But there may be language in there that will be offensive to some people, and for that reason, they won't talk about it to their children. So what you call the selective pressure, you're right, there is selection going on, but selection is not a sufficient condition for the Darwinian type of evolution that Richard Dawkins is talking about. Random mutation is an important aspect, and I still haven't seen it. But you can go ahead with the chocolate.
Right. Let me talk real quick about random mutation again. I already gave like 10 examples, but let me just go over one of those again. So let's look at one of these that will be, well, the origin of organic chemistry is a good one because Frederick Urey was just in his lab and he screwed up an experiment. And the result of his screwed up experiment was the production of urea. And nobody knew that we could produce urea. Urea is an organic molecule. We thought that there was something magical about organic chemistry, that it was a different thing than normal chemistry. But he accidentally, through a mistake in his experiment, through a copying error, a random copying error, he was trying to follow a recipe and he fucked it up. Through a random copying error, he created urea in the laboratory. And when people realized this, they're like, we didn't know that was possible. And then a bunch of people got together and said, okay, let's look into this deeper. But it was a random mutation that initiated that whole thing. Saran wrap, exact same thing. It was actually in a laboratory. They screwed up on a recipe. They overcooked some plastics they were making, and they invented saran wrap. Potato chips. It was an argument between a chef and his tenant at the restaurant. The guy kept on sending his French fries back. He didn't like them because they were too soggy and they were too thick. And so the chef said, okay, well, and he just shaved a potato, just tiny little shavings, and fried them until they were super crisp, and he gave those to him. And the guy loved it, and actually the chef loved it. And that's how we had the invention of potato chips. The microwave oven, someone was messing with microwaves, a microwave generator, and they realized it melted something in their pocket. Which could have been a horrible disaster, but all of these are the modifications that are happening to these memes, and they are random. And there's a lot of these examples. Safety glass was the merger of two things.
The problem is your standard for randomness in all these examples is non-intentionality on the part of the actor. But that's not what I mean by randomness. The actor that have modified these things, the way you describe them, we can see it's non-random. I mean, the guy was interacting with a customer. The guy was a restaurant owner in the first place. So he was looking to serve some food of some kind. All of these people had motivations and they had preferences about how they would try different things, how they would make errors. Their brain had already evolved to prefer certain things and not prefer others. To that extent, it's non-random in the sense that it's totally underlied by an evolutionary entity dependent on DNA, which is all I'm saying. And in my book, I reveal that these evolutionary entities, it's not that they're not going to change. It's not that they're not going to build up complexity. They will, but they will in a way that vastly differs from what Richard Dawkins described as the selfish gene effect. They will end up being enslaved by the entity that modifies them, the entity that makes the error, that makes the motivation. And in the case of humans, this entity is our brain and by consequence, our DNA.
Yeah, let me, we're about the hour mark. Kind of guide a little bit more. I've got some questions I want to ask as well to kind of guide this in a direction where people in the outside chat can actually follow along, because there is some confusion. If they're not familiar with memetics, then obviously this conversation is lost upon a lot of people. So kind of finish what you're saying, but then I would like to kind of guide a little bit more, especially what JF was saying, because I think there's something to be really dived into right there that I think that it just now have an hour discussion started to really talk about. So John, we want to finish it up real quick, and then Kyle and I are going to guide this a little bit for people. Is that okay?
Well, let me just, if I want to go into chocolate, that could actually be like 10 minutes. Just do the short version. Chocolate comes from a fruit. There's a fruit that's edible, and inside of it, the seeds are what we make chocolate out of. And the process to make chocolate is you take this fruit, you let it ferment for 4 days, then you pull the seeds out of fermentation, you let them dry for 1 month, then you bake them, then you separate them from a crust that forms on the outside, then you melt them, then you separate the cocoa from the cocoa butter, and then you add wax to the cocoa powder. It's an extremely complicated process. and then you add a ton of sugar, obviously, and then you've got chocolate candy. This process evolved. It started out with people saying, "Oh, I like the cacao plant because it makes fruit."